Good evening. My name is Ryan Flores. I'm the Technical Services Manager at the Westchester Public Library. Before I introduce Professor Tallamy, I just wanted to mention that the Westchester Public Library is a proud recipient of the Illinois Humanities Action Grant, and tonight's program marks the first in a series of virtual monthly programs funded in part by that grant. So that being said, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. With me, I have the Professor Doug Tallamy. He is the T.A. Barker Professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He has authored over 90 research articles, and he has written books including Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, Nature's Best Hope, and The Nature of Oaks, all which can be checked out at your local library. So come in and check them out. And with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Doug. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. Well, pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to talk to you about bringing nature home, why we need to do that. What do I mean by that? But before I do that, I want to talk about Edward O. Wilson's 2016 book called Half Earth. You're probably all aware that Dr. Wilson died the day after Christmas this year, and it's a tremendous loss to the field of conservation. And that has been a theme throughout his very long career, is how to save the life on planet Earth. So in Half Earth, he said, in order to save life anywhere on Earth, we need to save nature on at least half of planet Earth. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time talking about how we could actually do that. Of course, that's a very attractive idea to conservation biologists. Wow, put half of the Earth aside for nature, that'd be wonderful. Problem is, half of the terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and almost 8 billion people are in the other half with all of our airports and roads and shopping centers and detritus and everything else. And then we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how is this possible? Well, that's really what I want to talk about tonight. I think it is possible. I think we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation in order to do it. Back in 2019, at least on the East Coast, not sure if it was true around Chicago. I think it was, though. We had what we call an oak mast, where members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a hole for its head. Then it forced its head through that hole. Then it forced its entire body through there. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down, and that is a very dangerous time for this insect larva because it's good to eat. There are a lot of things out there that want to eat it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface in about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms an underground chamber. And within that chamber, it converts itself to a pupa and then stays there for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. People think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here at the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts, they chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it, and that's how the larva gets down there. Now, you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the next year, as most insects would? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, once they leave, it leaves a hole in the acorn, a true vacuum. You know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives inside the holes made by acorn weevils after the acorn weevils have left. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs. It's a procession that fills up that acorn in about 30 minutes. And once they're in there, they post a guard, make sure nobody else comes in. And this is where they will live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? That's very simple. That is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, it'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree, tap it below the surface of the soil. And of course, the object is they're going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they're planting 3 oak trees. Specialized relationship between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they feed their young, carpenter ants. And so you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Adrena facilii, unless you have facilia. That's the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. And pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We've got over 4,000 species of native bees in the US, and over a third of them are highly specialized on particular pollens. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtlehead. I could talk about nature's specialized relationships all night, all week, all year. But the point I want to make today is that these relationships, nature itself, is on the ropes. It's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave it as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we have grazed it. We got 770 million acres of rangeland in the US. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. And you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas like kudzu here in the South. In short, we have carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature, the number of species that we need to run the ecosystems that we all depend on. You might wonder why we've done this. I wonder why we've done this. And I don't know, but I suspect we thought that the earth, our nest was so large, we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion birds, breeding birds, in the last 50 years. It's almost a third of our North American bird population already gone. And the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. I don't know if you remember, but 4 weeks ago, we removed, 23 species from the endangered species list, not because we had saved them, but because they're already extinct. This is happening, but we can't allow it to happen. There's no way we can lose 1 million species on planet Earth without having really serious effects on humans. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you. But those efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, again, E.O. Wilson told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects on planet Earth, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food webs would collapse and those animals would disappear. Even many of our freshwater fish would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. Of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news here, believe it or not. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself. but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. And we're going to have to change the way we landscape pretty soon. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support systems that nature delivers us. I mean, we call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few of the things that healthy ecosystems produce, the things that we use. Everybody says they're producing them for us. Well, they're producing for everything that's out there, like oxygen, pretty important. Clean water, when water falls from the sky, plants grab it, they clean it, slow its journey before it gets to the sea, where it's too salty to use. Capturing carbon. They're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground through their roots. Enormously important ecosystem service today. Plants are building topsoil, holding it in place. They're preventing floods. They're dampening severe weather, converting sunlight into food. If we lost our plants, we'd have to eat sunlight, and that will be difficult. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea. We've got, again, almost 8 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before, just to keep humans happy. And of course, we'd like a few left over for the plants and animals out there. Now, we do have parks and we have preserves, and they're producing some ecosystem services, but they're too small, too isolated, and too few in number to produce the amount of ecosystem services that we need. So we now need to do conservation outside of parks and preserves in places like this. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups that have been able to do that, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, then going to another area, doing the same thing. Not sustainable behavior. So Aldo Leopold had a dream. He also had a lot of faith in humans. He believed that we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth, we had to use the land, we had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do those things gently enough that we didn't destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time, that notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture, that he may not have recognized it as an option. What I want to argue tonight is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We now need to practice conservation, actually restoration. We've got to rebuild nature where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not get diminished every single day, but thrive. Where should we start? Let's go back to private property. We can't ignore private property. We have to get conservation on private property because most of the land is privately owned. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 98% of Texas is privately owned. People argue about how much land in the entire country is privately owned, but one of the figures I see is 78%. Most of the land is privately owned. So again, we can't ignore it or we will fail. Now, when I talk about conservation, I'm not using the word correctly. We certainly want to conserve the places that aren't already wrecked, but I'm really talking about the places that are wrecked and how we need to put them back together again. And yes, they will not be exactly the way they were before we wrecked them, but we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions so that we have functioning nature again, functioning ecosystems, even if it's not exactly what it was before we humans came around. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks of ecosystems. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most powerful species, and then the other ones will join later. Two groups we can't do without include the flowering plants and the pollinators that allow them to reproduce. They, of course, are capturing the energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, converting it to food, then storing the food in their leaves for the most part. Well, most vertebrates don't eat plants. If the energy from the sun stays locked up in plant leaves, we won't have any animals. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate the plants. Most of the invertebrates are insects, and it turns out that caterpillars are enormously important in transferring energy to other animals. They're transferring more energy to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that have very few caterpillars in them, which is the way we do it today, that's a failed food web. Most of the energy remains locked up in the plants, and you have very few animals around. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. Now, near Chicago, you've got the black-capped chickadee. It's almost the same bird doing the same thing. They're the birds that are feeders right now, eating seeds. And so people think, well, that's what they need. 50% of their diet during the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. But when they're reproducing, when they have babies to feed, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch entirely to invertebrates, mostly insects. And most of the insects that they're feeding their young are caterpillars if they're in a healthy environment. And they're not exceptions. Most of the birds that are out there rear their young on insects. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's lots of lines of evidence that suggest that. But this is a citizen science project that one of my previous PhD students, Ashley Kennedy, did. She put out a call to bird photographers around the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season when they were carrying food to the nest. Send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds as possible. And this is a summary of her results. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families that she had enough data for, caterpillars dominated the diet. So imagine what would happen if we didn't have enough caterpillars in the landscape. Most of our birds would not be able to breed successfully. So something seems to be special about caterpillars. What is it? Well, a number of things special about caterpillars. One of them is that they're soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is its exoskeleton, its cuticle. It's made of chitin, undigestible. Birds don't want a lot of that. And because they're soft, you can stuff the caterpillar down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just take it and stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, many of our caterpillars, or many of our birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious, they're high in fat, high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to most other insects of exoskeleton, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and many beetles have very sharp edges too. And finally, caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. I mentioned carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates. And we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? Well, during the breeding season, they're not eating plants, they're eating insects, and the carotenoid content of various insects and other invertebrates is not equally distributed. So these first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of prey. Here's the adult caterpillar here, the moths and butterflies themselves. They have far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. The carotenoids are in the green leaves. And here's the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that birds are not, or that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They're essential components of bird diet. So let's just say that birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many caterpillars do they need? Well, that's a good question. Let's go back to chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of chickadees? Well, 1 or 2 a day is not enough. They need thousands of caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And that depends on the number of chicks in the nest, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars, again, to make one clutch of chickadees. That's a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because that's pretty much all we have in a lot of places, then you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard, or they won't have enough food. They forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not produce all of those caterpillars, all of those insects, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is directly related to bird decline. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, and divided the terrestrial bird species into 2 groups, the ones that require insects and the ones that do not require insects. So this would be the doves and finches that can reproduce on seeds. They make a little milk out of the seed and feed that to their babies. They didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the birds that require insects, that can't do well without them, lost on average 10 million individuals per species. Doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as you take away bird food, the birds don't do very well. That certainly makes sense. So we need a new goal for our landscaping. In the past, we've landscaped with one goal, and that was to make our landscapes pretty. Okay, we can keep that goal, but we need to add ecological function to it too. How do we make our landscapes living landscapes? How do we create the conditions that allow other species to exist there? So how do we add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you do that by adding the plants that make those caterpillars, which seems easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which caterpillars or which plants we put in our yard. And we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all of the buckthorn and all of the burning bush and all the crepe myrtle and all of the Bradford pear and all of the hostas and all of the things that we typically landscape with. These are plants from Asia in your yard, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a new monarch butterfly is milkweeds. That is called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them specialized. Plants don't want to be eaten. Plants want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense. It keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect species can't adapt to all of them. So they pick 1 or 2 plant lineages that are really similar in how they protect themselves. And they develop the specialized adaptations necessary to get around those defenses. They develop the enzymes, help them store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. But that takes a long evolutionary history for all of those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant lineage. And that's why if you take the milkweed out of your yard and replace it with hostas, the monarch doesn't start to eat hostas. It's locked into milkweeds. If you take away their food, they disappear. And that's why when we bring in plants from Asia or South America or any other places we bring in plants from to landscape with, it typically destroys not just our suburban and urban food webs, but many of these plants escape into our natural areas. Invasive plants are a huge problem, as you know, and it destroys the food webs in those natural areas at the same time. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to rebuild the food webs in any place, we're going to have to choose the right plants, the plants that do that, or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants. And I'm going to start with my house right here. It's where my wife Cindy and I live in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is what it looked like when we moved in the year 2000. It was part of a farm that it was broken up into 10-acre lots, very old farm, farmed almost 300 years. And the last thing they did before they broke it up was mow it for hay. So our, very few plants there, but our goal was to rebuild the food web that was once at that site. And the only way you can do that is to bring those caterpillars back. So here's an example of what we did. I wanted to see if I could attract the Canadian owlet to our yard. That's what a Canadian owlet looks like. I'd never seen a Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like. Well, Canadian owlets are host plant specialists, just like monarchs, but they specialize on meadow rue. And we didn't have any meadow rue. There's no meadow rue anywhere around here. The whole place was farmed to death for hundreds of years. So I got some seeds, meadow rue seeds from someplace. I planted them. They grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I had very little faith that Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue amongst a sea of everything else. So I didn't even go out and check my little planting for how it must have been 2 months after I planted it. I was walking by for another reason one day, and the meadow rue was covered with Canadian owlets. They had come right away. I'm still surprised about that. So it was a big success. Now we've got a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. This beautiful moth actually has nothing to do with goldenrod. That's a misnomer. It's a specialist on this plant, Bidens arastosa. Ditch daisy. I did know where there was some ditch daisy. Power line cut about 14 miles away. I got some seed, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. Well, I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but they did. And now we've got a good population of both of them. So we've added 2 more species. That's 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. Wanted the hackberry emperor at our house, not because it's the most beautiful butterfly, but because it belongs there. It's one of the species that should be in that part of Oxford, Pennsylvania. Well, as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on Celtis, and we didn't have any hackberry. So I planted hackberry. We had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find our hackberry, but they finally did. I checked one of my hackberry branches in June. There were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on a single branch, another big success. So now I've added 6 species to the property. And that's how it went. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own. And along with it came many of the plants or the caterpillars that specialize on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown hooded owlet, the Arsidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth. I don't know why it hasn't come yet. That's what its caterpillars look like. But this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I check my goldenrod at the end of the summer. Hope I find these larvae. One of these years I will, and that'll be a great year. Planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I've heard that people don't like Virginia creeper. I just don't know why. It's a great native plant. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. Has good fall color. Makes very valuable berries for the birds in the fall. They're very high in fat. It's a good ground cover. It's a good pollinator plant, believe it or not. The flowers are small and inconspicuous, so we don't even notice when it's in bloom until you see that cloud of the tiny native bees flying around it. Remember, when you're planting a pollinator garden, you're planting it for the pollinators. If it's not big, showy flowers, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant for the big sphinx moths that are one of the primary components of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the double-toothed prominent at our house because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. Well, it's a specialist on elm, particularly American elm. We didn't have any American elm. We lost it to the Dutch elm disease a long time ago. But there are a couple of big American elms at the University of Delaware that did not die. And every year they make a lot of seed. And I collected seed shortly after we moved in and planted it at home. And those trees grew really nicely. They're 80 feet tall now. And they have brought the double-toothed prominent to our property, American elm. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth to our property because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. But believe it or not, we had no evening primrose, so I planted that. The moths came, spend the day with their heads stuffed in the flowers. They're very cute. And I planted lots of oaks. Now, those are just examples of the plant lineages I put in our yard. But I want to spend some time on oaks because they're such important plants. This is the Bedford Oak in Bedford, New York. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local ecosystem, what it's doing for you in your yard, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted my oaks, most of my oaks as acorns or as 2-foot bare root whips. So the acorns are free. The bare root whips cost about $1.50 each. And immediately they started to rebuild the food web that support the birds and everything else in our yard. We're bringing in things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of moths have come to the oaks at our house, and they have come right away. This is a pin oak that it just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So immediately it starts to contribute to my local food web. This is what our house looks like now in the summertime. Got a little lawn here, but otherwise we put a lot of plants back. And as I noticed, as soon as I put the plants back, life started to return to our house. So 4 years ago, I decided to try to take a picture of every species of moth that occurs at our house. Remember, moths come from caterpillars, and caterpillars are a perfect index for how large and stable your food web is. And I'm still at it, but I have so far taken pictures of 1,140 species of moths right here at home. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the landmass, we have 44% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline that we saw in 2020. World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3, and it didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. All we did was put the plants back. So these are scary, really disheartening headlines. Don't give up. We can turn this around, maybe not for the largest things on the planet, but for most of the things, if we put the plants that they require, they make the food that all these animals need. Don't give up is all I'm trying to say here. Of course, we have 10 acres, and a lot of people say, that's a lot of land. Will it work in smaller parcels in suburbia, for example? And that's a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan's Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of suburbia. So they're surrounded by people with the big lawns. And when they moved in, their yard was choked with with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. So they removed that. Then they planted 75 species of native plants and then put a little water feature they call a bubbler in. And then they sat back and started to, count the birds that are using their yard. And they are up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. Just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. So right next to you folks, and I mean in Chicago, that's one of the towers at O'Hare Airport. Just 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all. So she is a tiny little island. It's a pretty island. And by the way, Pam's a landscape designer. I hear you got some money to put in a native plants around the library. So hire Pam. Anyway, she made it look nice by doing the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, plus a water feature for the birds. And then she sat back and started to count the birds that are using her tiny little piece of nature. She's up to 120 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house. Okay, it works. But there are 4 things we need to do if we're going to make it work in a big way. And one of them is we've got to shrink the area that we have in lawn. As of 2005, we had more than 40 million acres of lawn nationwide, which is an area as big as New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Now, I know we need our lawn to advertise our status, and we need our lawn to put in our Halloween decorations on. But what if we took that area of lawn and cut it in half? I'm not going to get rid of lawn. It's still a perfect plant to walk on. It's a good cue for care. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? What if we took areas like this and put in some native plant? This is Dan Getman's yard. He sent me this picture a couple of weeks ago. I think he lives in northern Missouri. Has a big lawn, but he's starting to fill it in with patches of native plants. It's a young planting, but that's what we're talking about. Well, that would give us 20 million acres we could put towards conservation. And if we do this at home, we can build a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put up a piece of nature, little park right where we live? We get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with nature. And we can do it at our own pace, our own timing. All we have to do is go outside. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, 375 million people went to national parks last year. Spend a good deal of time in a parking lot when you do that. It's free. There's no admission fee, no travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is absolutely necessary if you're going to develop that personal relationship with Mother Nature, not mediated by somebody else. And I think it's really necessary for our poor kids, many of whom are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying to expose them to nature. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour to a natural area. Then they walk around a natural area, and then the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they drive home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world at home, all they have to do is go outside alone and develop a relationship with it, get to know it on their own, alone, no parental supervision. Trust them. They will come home again. I think this is so important because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. And if they don't know how to steward the planet, if they don't know why they need to steward the planet, if they don't love stewarding the planet, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. And maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii in a very modest patch of nature. It's a little piece of grass with a hedge. but there are anole lizards that live there. And when she discovered that, she sent me this picture to describe how you hunt the lizards. You get in the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. Then you crawl slowly toward the lizard. You're going to sneak up on it. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You catch the lizard. You put it in an aquarium. You learn how to take care of the lizard. You learn how to be a good steward of some other life form. You learn how to care about that life form. You're developing that personal relationship I'm talking about. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress the rest of her life catching lizards. I don't think. She sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. And I also guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. If you want your kids to do more than catch lizards, get Nancy Stranissy's Nature Play at Home. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and please register your property on the map. It's free. All you're doing is putting your location in your county. I guess you folks are over here. And the amount of area that you are stewarding, the amount of area that you're going to plant in natives or you already have, or the amount of area that's in a woodlot that you're protecting. And your little piece of that county will light up with a firefly. And the idea is to get this idea that we are all important components of the future of conservation to go viral. So we can see the US light up. We're working on this map so that it will be lit up all the time with the areas where people have joined. We've got over 12,000 members at this point, but we need a lot more than that for this to work. So please get yourself on the map. And people say, are you using our data? I don't even know what that means. I don't even know what my password is. No, we're not using anybody's data. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. What plants should we put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. This is a Roman arch. The keystone is a stone in the middle of the arch. If you take the keystone out, the arch falls down. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because the keystone plants are making most of the food. Just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. Which means 86% of our native plants, they're contributing, but not all that much. So think of the keystone plants as the 2x4s in the ecological house that you are building. They're essential to keep the house standing. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. You're not through building your house when you've got your keystone plants, but they're an essential part of it. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? Ecologically, on average, they certainly are. But there's a lot of natives out there that aren't producing all that much. So the question really is, do we want to plant the native species, the native plants that are supporting the most pollinators and the most caterpillars, or not? In the past, I used to get emails from somebody saying, don't you know that ginkgos, ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago. That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether that makes them native today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're doing anything or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. Today, here, they produce 0 species of caterpillars. They're not contributing to the local food web. What's contributing more than anything else? It's one of our oaks. Oaks support 557 species of caterpillars just in the mid-Atlantic states, over 950 species nationwide. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that. It's not the only keystone plant, but in 84% of the counties in which they occur, oaks are number 1. So if you go to Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation and put in your zip code, the ranked list of the most important plants in terms of supporting caterpillars for your county will pop up, both the woody plants and the herbaceous plants. So this is what a typical list will look like. Oaks are number one, followed usually closely by native cherries and native willows and so on. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. If I go to a nursery and I say, I want to buy a cherry, they're going to sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia. If I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. If I want to buy a birch, it'll probably be a European birch, so on. You've got to specify that you want a native member of these very important genera, because if you don't get a native member, it's going to reduce caterpillar use by 68%. We've done that experiment. These are typically the most important herbaceous genera, not just in terms of supporting caterpillars, but also in terms of supporting our specialist bees. If you have goldenrods and the various genera asters were broken up into and sunflowers, particularly perennial sunflowers, you can support up to 44 species of specialist bees that won't be there if you don't have those particular plants. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out now which strongly suggests that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines. And these are all the ways that our lights are killing our insects at night, particularly those all-important moths that make those caterpillars. To me, this is good news, believe it or not, because we've got to turn around insect declines. Insects are keeping us alive in this planet. They are the little things that run the world. We can't watch them disappear. So we've got to stop that decline, turn it around, and help them rebuild. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, by turning our lights out at night, we're getting off easy. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn my light out over my garage or my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on it. So it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to recognize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best, the most effective, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects than our white wavelengths. If we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we could save millions of insects and millions of dollars too if we make them LEDs, because they're a lot more energy efficient. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all of our insects. Seems like we got no end to the ways we like to kill our insects. This is a booming business all around the country, and the Mosquito Joe is single-handedly undoing everything I've been talking about for the last 20 years. But he says it's okay because this is a natural product. Well, it is a natural product. It comes from the same compound that's in chrysanthemums, pyrethroids. But cyanide is a natural product too, so I'm not sure that's a good argument. He also says it only kills mosquitoes, and I wish he was right. I really wish he was right. But in fact, it kills all the insects it comes in contact with. And if you watch those giant fogging machines, the fog goes everywhere. I mean, we're just wiping out everything. I don't know if you saw the headlines, not this fall, but 2 falls ago, there were big monarch kills during monarch migration. They flew through Mosquito Joe, hundreds of monarchs dead on the ground. The interesting thing is, the ironic thing is, it doesn't work. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you've got to kill 90% of them. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50%. So he's killing mosquitoes, but not nearly enough to get any control, which means he's got to keep coming back and keep charging you and killing everything else in the meantime. If you really want to kill mosquitoes, try mosquito dunks. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put a handful of straw or hay in there, and let it ferment for a couple of days. We're doing this during the warm parts of the year. And by ferment, what's happening is it's building up the population of algae and diatoms in your bucket. And that's what the mosquito larvae eat. So once you make this brew, that becomes irresistible to females that want to lay their eggs. They will lay their eggs in your bucket, put in a mosquito dunk that you get at the hardware store. This sheet costs $9. This is Bacillus Thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is mosquito larvae. Any dragonfly larva that gets in there is not going to hurt it if your dog drinks it or a bird drinks it. It won't hurt it a bit. It's very targeted. You might put a coarse screen over it so the local chipmunk doesn't drown himself. but otherwise it's very effective. It's cheap and it's highly targeted. If everybody did this in the yard, we would have far fewer mosquitoes. Fourth thing we need to do is to create landscapes that allow caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an example. This is an oak tree. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars that are on oaks. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all again. And that's great. I wished everything did that, but most species don't. Most species finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree and wiggle their way underneath the ground to form a pupa underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact our soils under a tree so that they're rock hard, and it's very difficult for those caterpillars to get underground. So in so many places, the way we landscape becomes an ecological trap. Any moth that comes in and lays its eggs up here, the eggs will hatch, the caterpillars will develop and drop down and die. And I am convinced that this is another major cause of insect declines around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the solution either. Here's what most people do. They're putting a tree in a yard, and we're just starting to measure how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you've got a layered landscape. It creates a soft landing for those caterpillars. They fall down, and the soil's not compacted. They can get beneath the soil surface very easily. No fear of being squashed or mowed. Plenty of leaf litter down there that they can spin their cocoons in. Much higher survivorship. This is not only a place you can do your spring ephemeral gardening and make it beautiful, but it's a great way to reduce the area that's in lawn. You put big beds around all of your trees. The bigger, the better. Soft landings, safe landings, all safe sites. Use your ground covers very liberally. Things like wild ginger or mayapple or foam flower or ferns, all very effective ground covers that will help those caterpillars. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. These are red maple trees. Any caterpillar developing on these red maple trees can drop down into this fern bank here and successfully complete their development, even though it's the middle of a city. So we can do a lot better for those caterpillars just by the way we landscape underneath our trees. Another former grad student, Desiree Naranko, did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And her results suggest there's actually room for compromise in our plant choice. And that's good news to me. She asked a very simple question. How well do chickadee populations do over time in landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by non-native introduced plants? And the first thing she found is that when they were dominated by introduced plants, they produced 75% fewer caterpillars. So there's 75% less bird food there right from the start. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees. So every landscape had a nest box up in it, and the chickadees would come. And if it was dominated by introduced plants, they'd look around and say, there's simply not enough food here, so we won't even try to breed. If they did try to breed, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. And if you put all that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your yard, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We looked at woody plant biomass because that's where chickadees forage, on woody plants. This dotted line up here is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long. And if you reproduce at that rate, you've got a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, you've got a growing population. But if you make fewer babies, over here, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population. And you get that when you have more than 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native. Right here is where those lines overlap or intersect, speaking very, very generally, very liberally. But that suggests you could have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying your local food web. Now, none of these plants should be invasive plants. No burning bush, no calorie pear, no barberry, because those are ecological tumors. They don't stop in your yard. They just keep going. But there's plenty of non-native ornamental plants that are not invasive. Your forsythia, that ginkgo we talked about, as long as they don't dominate the landscape with their biomass. So that's the area of compromise I'm excited about. Here's Dan Getman's landscape. I don't know if you picked it up the first time. This is a ginkgo. Why does he have a ginkgo in this native planting? Because his wife loves ginkgos and she asked him to put it in, so he did. Is it destroying the functionality of this landscape? No, it's not. So it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those productive native plants. If we get these guys, more of these guys into our landscapes, we can tolerate some non-natives without any problem. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a design by Lynn O'Shaughnessy. You don't get more formal than that. It's a picture by a drone 400 feet up. It's a large garden, and every plant in the garden was a native plant. So formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a traditional or a typical suburban lot like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It makes it stand out and says, this is not just a patch of weeds that we forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's servicing a number of native bees. Not very big, could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Remember why we need pollinators. You hear all the time we need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. That's not true. Your own May Barenbaum, University of Illinois, tried to find out where that figure came from. The closest she could come up with is they pollinate about 1/12 of our crops. But we do need pollinators, and it's not just next to farms. We need them because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. How about this design? It's a Drew Latham design. He used to be up in your neck of the woods. I think he's moved. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. It really seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program that encourages homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's called the Lawn to Legume program, very popular. Pennsylvania's got a new lawn conversion program. Get up to $5,000 per acre to pay for converting that big lawn into a native planting. This was designed to help watersheds, believe it or not. That was the motivation, but it's a great example of how we can do more than one thing at a time. You can help the watershed, and if you use native plants, you can help biodiversity at the same time. There's an island off of Florida that is paying residents to allow burrowing owls to burrow in their front yards. Burrowing owls are listed species, and this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. So, you know, if you get paid to take care of the endangered species on your property, everybody would want one. Right now, you get fined if you do anything in your property, and you know, people kill them because they don't want to have to deal with it. There's a bounty on calorie pears. It used to be in St. Louis and Fayetteville, Arkansas. I think they've got one in North Carolina. South Carolina has banned them outright. You take out your calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. And even public utilities are getting into the act. $100 coupons in San Antonio for people who plant water efficient native plants and not the water thirsty non-natives. And of course, the very successful lawn conversion programs in California. This is going up. You get now $3 per square foot for every square foot of lawn you take out and replace with a xeric planting. California does not have one drop of water to waste on lawn. And they're starting to realize that. I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's a serious one. We've come to think of nature as if it's optional. We like it, but we don't think it's essential. You know, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature takes a back seat. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife, save nature, so that future generations can enjoy it. That's what I get from this poster. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating the national park system. Beautiful places, we want to save them so that future generations can enjoy them. True enough, but to me, that suggests nature's there just for entertainment. It is far more than that. We need to save nature. We need to save wildlife so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. And we talked about that. If we confined conservation just to places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are too few, too small, and too isolated. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I don't like that language because it suggests they're places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our roadsides, including our corporate landscapes, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to put the plants back. We need to glue our rug back together again, folks, not just to make biological corridors so that plants and animals can move back and forth between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats where we've destroyed them. Right where we live, where we work, where we play, where we farm. When we put those plants back for the first time in modern history, humans will start to coexist with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet, but I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset is, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. And we are very good at teaching this one. We are terrible at teaching our kids and our peers about their obligation to stewarding planet Earth. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but it does mean you can save biodiversity where you do live. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, right now, we've got big problems on planet Earth, and most people feel absolutely powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. One person can use Keystone Plants. One person can turn out their lights. One person can put in pollinator gardens. One person can get rid of the invasive plants that are already on their property. We didn't even talk about that. One person can totally revitalize the little ecosystem in their yard and enhance their greater local ecosystem rather than degrade it. And this approach also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You'll get depressed. Just think about the piece of the planet that you can influence. If you own property, that's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park, help a preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power. We certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own fate. Fortunately, nature has proven to be a lot more malleable, resilient, and forgiving than I ever thought she would be. I can guarantee, though, she is not endlessly resilient and not endlessly forgiving. But I do think she will give us one more chance. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Doug, for that very interesting presentation. I learned a lot.
Great.
before I go to the questions, so if anyone has anything to add, please type so in the chat. I wanted to put on there that I did post the link for homegrownnationalpark.org and the link for the native plant finder.
Great, thank you.
So we did have one question come in earlier, and I guess this would be one kind of for Westchester in general, but our condo association has a huge area of grass in back of some of our units, about 60 yards by 30 yards. What can be done ecologically to turn into something natural and easy to care for? I think that highlights you explained how it could be done, but how easy are these native, homegrown national parks to care for?
Well, no landscape is maintenance free, particularly when you're establishing a new landscape. You've got to get the plants and water them in the beginning until they get established. But of course, native plants in the right place are going to be very hardy. You're not going to have to worry about them after that. With our invasive species load out there, we always have to monitor, make sure they don't come in, because they'll try to come in. But if you get a well-planted landscape, you don't have to mow it every weekend. You really do over time reduce the amount of maintenance that's out there. It can be, a lot of people think right away we're gonna make a prairie. We're going to put in a meadow, because that's the easiest thing. That's actually the hardest thing to do. The easiest thing is to plant a tree and put a bed around it. And if you live in a condo, that you have no responsibility for the landscape, or if you live in an apartment where you really have no responsibility, you still can say, let me own this tree. I'm gonna take care of it. I'm gonna take care of the planting underneath it. You won't have to worry about it. Then, the super would probably let you do anything you want, as long as it's going to reduce the amount of work and not make it harder for him. So that means everybody in the complex could adopt a tree, plant a tree, and it would reduce the maintenance of the entire landscape by a lot. And all you have to take care is one tree. It'd be great.
Okay, thank you. We had one person ask, what can we do if our lawn was previously sprayed with glyphosates? I think I'm saying that correctly.
Well, if it was sprayed with glyphosate, it's probably dead.
Oh.
And then you don't have a lawn anymore, and you can plant over it. None of these herbicides last forever, particularly on herbaceous plants. Some of the systemics and woody plants can last a while, but I wouldn't worry about it. Plant right through it, and in no time at all, it'll be pesticide free.
Okay. Got one from Annette. My neighbor believes that her wild ginger ground cover thickly planted below her oaks is choking her oak trees. Have you ever heard this before?
I've heard everything, I guess, but I don't know why she believes that. It's not true. I don't know what to say. Oaks of different species have variously deep root systems. So if it's a red oak or a bur oak, it could probably be a bur oak. I mean, they got huge root systems that go way down. It's not choking your oak tree.
We've got one from Jerry. What are your thoughts on mulching fall leaves with a mower and leaving the chopped leaf litter?
Well, remember all those caterpillars that are dropping from the tree and spinning cocoons in those leaves. The polyphemus cocoon doesn't always hang up there. It falls down, or depending on your tree, you've got a nice Luna moth cocoon down there, and many, many smaller logs. When you run it through the mower, you've just ground them all up. So we have 70 species of, we call them litter moths, where the caterpillars actually eat the dead leaves on the ground. It's better than raking the leaves up and putting them in the garbage can, because then you're at least keeping the leaf material on site, and it will release the nutrients that tree needs. But it is much better if you don't mulch it.
Okay, good to know. We've got a question from Scott. Some of my milkweeds were unhealthily covered with aphids. I read that my options were to gently wash the plants with soap and water or buy some ladybugs. Which option would be the best for the birds and butterflies?
Yeah, that's an invasive aphid that we have up here. It's called the oleander aphid, and they can get out of hand. I wouldn't bother buying ladybug beetles. We already have them around, and they will find your aphids. If you buy them, a lot of times people collect them from summer ice sites. So the first thing the beetle does is it wakes up and flies 20 miles, and so it won't stick in your yard. But the soap option is a good one. The aphids can be fairly cyclical. They're not always bad. Watch very carefully. You don't want to, wash off any monarch larvae. Remember, they start out as tiny little guys. So try that.
Kurt asks, I have heard the story of your property many times. I know you've had a long career in entomology, but how did the experience of building your personal national park change and expand your views / experiences?
It expanded my views tremendously because it showed me how easy it was and how well it works. I had no idea that I could attract 1,140 species of moths so far to my little plot of land just by putting the plants back. Before we started this, before we moved in that house, I'm an entomologist, but I was not thinking about insect declines. I was not thinking about native plants or invasive plants. So that's, this has been fairly new stuff for me. And I've experimented to see what works. Anyway, hands-on helped a lot.
I've one question came up is what would be the worst plant to have? So like what is the worst non-native that you think that people are just planting too much of because it looks pretty or it's easy to maintain?
There are a lot of worse ones. The ones people are actively planting still in a lot of places is Callery pear, Bradford pear. It's just a terrible plant. I can drive from New York City to Richmond, Virginia in the spring, and it is white on both sides of the road all the way down. All of these are escape pears. But, of course, buckthorn's a terrible one. You go to other places, autumn olive's terrible. Porcelain berry, at least in the east here, is becoming the kudzu of the north. In the south, of course, kudzu is terrible. Along wetlands, Phragmites is terrible. Japanese knotweed is very hard to control. There's a big long list of the worst plants.
That's good to know. Do you consider the use of native cultivars is equally beneficial to the landscape as non-natives, or does their mix in the landscape have more beneficial value?
Well, most cultivars of native plants are not as bad as non-natives that are contributing just about nothing. Cultivars can contribute quite a bit depending on what the genetic change was to create the cultivar. One thing that our experiments have shown us is that when you take a green leaf and make it red or purple to enhance its aesthetic value, that really clobbers the ability of insects to use that plant, because a purple leaf or a red leaf is filled with anthocyanins, and that's a feeding deterrent. But many other cultivar changes, like taking a tall plant and making it short, or enhancing berry size, things like that, don't discourage insects at all. Having said that, we want to encourage the use of straight species as much as possible, because cultivars have zero genetic variability. And in this day of climate change, we want as much genetic variability out. So I think it's important to go to the nursery, ask for straight species. If you don't have it, then leave. And they'll get the idea that the market for these and start to carry.
Okay, so I think that would be all the questions we had for the day. So I want to thank you again, Doug. This was a very informative and interesting presentation. I learned a lot.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks for the chance.
Yep. So thank you all for attending, and you have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Take care.